books, or ideas, what you consume influences who you become. On the Mind and Matter podcast, we learn together from the best scientists and thinkers alive today about how your mind-body reacts to what you feed it. Before starting Mind and Matter, I spent 10 years in academia doing scientific research. I got a PhD in neuroscience where I focused on neuroendocrinology and the neurobiology of behavior, and before that, I specialized in molecular, developmental, and evolutionary genetics. I use my scientific background to help parse and translate the information that guests share on the podcast. In addition to the podcast, I write long-form written content inspired by the show where I integrate what I've learned across episodes. I also have a free weekly newsletter where I provide you with upcoming guests, share links, and provide commentary on scientific studies and research that I'm reading, and more. Visit mindandmatter.substack.com to find all of my content. The full version of this episode is available to paid subscribers at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. The full version is also freely available on my YouTube page. Just look up Mind and Matter or my name, Nick Jikomis, on YouTube, and you'll find the episode there. This is a partial version of the episode, and so it'll cut off partway through, but you'll still get a significant portion. So sign up to become a paid subscriber at Substack or visit my YouTube page to get the full episode. Hey everyone, I want to take just a minute to tell you about a really cool health monitoring device I've been using called Lumen. It's a handheld, pocket-sized device with a sleek design. The Lumen device measures CO2 levels in your breath, which allows their technology to determine the extent to which your body is burning fats versus carbohydrates. Lumen helps improve your metabolic flexibility, your body's efficiency in shifting between using fats and carbs for energy. I use this device in the morning or before bed or after meals or after workouts to track my metabolism. With just a couple weeks of use, I learned a lot about which foods were causing my body to burn mostly fat, mostly carbs, or both, as well as how long I needed to fast and how hard I needed to exercise to promote fat burning. Being able to track whether your body is burning fat versus carbs will help you figure out how your body responds to your lifestyle and whether or not your weight loss and fitness strategies are actually working. Lumen is great for anyone looking to optimize their health for either weight loss or athletic performance. Their easy-to-use app allows you to track your results together with what you're eating and how you're exercising, and it syncs with other devices like the Apple Watch. Click the link in the episode description to learn more and use the code MINDMATTER, MINDMATTER, to get 10% off your Lumen device today. That's on top of the site-wide sale they are currently running, and the Lumen device is eligible to be paid for with FSA and HSA health accounts. Check out the link in the episode description for more info. Studies?
Sure. So I'm a professor in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at the University of California in San Francisco. And our lab is kind of broadly interested in how the gut microbiome, the trillions of microbes that are found within our GI tract, influence both nutrition and pharmacology.
Yeah, and so you study lots of interesting stuff. There's many different directions we could take this conversation. I've covered the microbiome a lot on this podcast. I've covered diet stuff a lot on this podcast. I want to start off pretty high level and get you talking about something that doesn't necessarily have to do with your work specifically, but it's sort of broader questions related to diet and nutrition and how it's studied in the literature. And it obviously ties into the work you do, but I want to talk about some of the different types of diets that are out there that are commonly studied and some confusion and shortcomings maybe even the literature has in terms of how those things are studied and how they're talked about. So the place I want to start is I'm going to keep it vague intentionally. One of the most common diets that you'll read if you dig into the scientific literature that has to do with diet is the so-called high-fat diet. And maybe some of the listeners will know from listening to me before, but this is one of my biggest frustrations in the literature, this term high fat diet. What can you tell us about the high fat diet and what that term maybe doesn't tell us, or problems that come from labeling and using diets with that level of specificity?
Yeah, that's a great question and kind of near and dear to my heart. I don't know if you saw, but we had a paper a few years ago where we did a meta-analysis where we were interested in kind of comparing the microbiome profiles, mostly in mice, but also a little bit in humans, across the hundreds of studies where people have fed mice some kind of form of a high-fat diet. compared to a control diet. And so is something we thought about a lot in that study. But to your question, we, I guess going back to my work in grad school, we're kind of careful to use the term high fat, high sugar diet because
Mm.
we thought, especially when you think about the microbiome, it's important to keep in mind the kind of other macronutrient components. And so, like, typically when people model obesity in mice, they give them a diet that's not only high in fat, but also really enriched for sucrose and maltodextrin,
Hmm.
relatively simple carbohydrates that are readily digested by the host.
Hmm. But
And then you're kind
importantly,
of stripping out a lot of the fiber or
yeah,
complex carbohydrate.
but importantly, when they give them these diets that are high in fat and high in these other carbohydrates, they simply usually call it high fat diet, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, typically like HFD or like high fat diet is the acronym, which is misleading, for the point you make, which is that it's actually different in terms of the types of carbohydrates. But even kind of more profoundly, something that I think a lot of people don't realize is that, normally when we study lab mice, they're effectively eating whole foods, given that it's largely soy and corn and other kind of commodity crops that are used to kind of smash together into these pellets, um, as opposed to your typical high fat diet, which is actually made from purified ingredients. So it's more like a processed food that you might buy in the grocery store.
Hmm.
And so we think in terms of how the microbiome responds to these diet shifts, it's really important whether or not they're kind of seeing the nutrient in the context of a real food as opposed to just a purified sugar.
Yeah. So when we read high fat diet in the literature, more often than not, it's not merely a high fat diet. It's high fat plus high carbohydrate. And if you compare, there's hundreds, if not thousands, probably thousands of studies that use the so-called high fat diet, or that at least they use that nomenclature, but they can
Mm-hmm.
vary tremendously, not just in whether or not they also have high carbohydrate or high sugar content, but also the specific types of fats they use
Mm-hmm.
and all sorts of different things. And so it's a bit confusing because, if you were to just look at the literature and say, let's just look at all the studies that use a quote high fat diet and see what they say. It's actually not, it's just not appropriate to sort of like look at the one vector of where all those studies point, because it's really many different diets that are simply, we're using the same words to describe.
Yeah, totally. And that gets really kind of complex, especially if like every tiny variation matters for what
Mm-hmm.
you're studying. In our case, the microbiome, but others might be interested in, body weight or other host phenotypes. And I think one way that we've graphed this is to you can kind of have a triangle where, one corner is a diet with 100% fat, and then the other corner is 100% protein, and then the third is 100% carb. And then that allows you to kind of, in that um, triangular space, kind of plot where each diet falls. And
Yeah.
in the meta-analysis that we did to look at the gut microbiome, what was really striking is kind of how variable the high fat diets were in terms of not only like how far they pushed the fat intake, but also whether or not protein and carb changed.
Yeah.
And that's at the simplest level when all you care about is level of macronutrients, and we're not worrying about the type of fat or type of carbohydrate. Um, and then you can even find examples where the control diet is kind of higher in fat um, than some of the high fat diets.
Wow. Yeah.
And so, it means that, it's like really important, to take into account exactly what you're comparing when you want to, see whether or not you see the same effects study to study.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So you're saying there's studies where, like, study A might use a high fat diet and study B has a control diet, what they call a non high fat diet, and it might actually have
right.
higher fat content than the other study that says high fat diet.
Yeah, like my low fat diet might be higher in fat than your high fat
Right, right,
diet.
right.
Because like typically I mean, it makes sense how we get here because people are using these terms in the context of two diets that are in their study, right?
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah,
like really they're just trying to say that one is higher and one is lower.
Yeah.
But it's kind of tempting to apply that between studies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And then like one thing that's obviously becoming more popular and getting more attention in the research world is the ketogenic diet. So if we get a little bit more
mhm.
specific with how we describe these things, high fat diets may or may not be ketogenic. So a ketogenic diet is a high fat diet, but when we read high fat diet in the literature broadly speaking, those are often not ketogenic, whether or not they have high fat, whatever that means exactly. And they also often have high carb diets. Can you just talk a little bit so is it fair to say that the majority of the time when a study says high fat diet, it's probably pretty high in both fat and carbs and therefore not ketogenic?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And you're kind of like reliving the journey that I went through, because starting in grad school and then continuing today in the lab. And I guess just to kind of finish the thought on the meta-analysis, I think one of the kind of really what I thought was good news pieces of data that came out of this is that, even though there is this tremendous variation in the types of low fat and high fat diets that are used in the literature, when we were able to kind of combine microbiome profiles from all of these different studies, um, we were still able to capture really reproducible effects on the gut microbiota. And so, that suggests that really, the microbiota is responding to a large extent, to these general shifts in macronutrient intake, and that they don't, even though, maybe at a quantitative level, they can sense the type of fat, but that the kind of general trends are able to transcend the specific flavor of high fat diet. And so I think that was good news, and kind of like, it suggests that you might be able to translate some of this to humans, where there is no kind of single high fat diet in the human population. We're all eating variable diets
Mm-hmm,
to each
mm-hmm.
other. And so hopefully, we can kind of find these, more foundational ways in which the microbiome responds to a shift in macronutrient intake.
Yeah, and
Um,
if we think in terms of this sort of triangle you described of macronutrients, so you've
mhm,
got one corner is carbohydrates, one's fat, one's protein. A given diet's going to fall somewhere in that space. It might be high in one, low in the other two, or vice versa, or high in two and low in one, whatever. Can you give us a sense, a very, very basic sense for like when we talk about the standard American diet, the diet that's going to be fairly representative of what the average person in the US is eating, where would it fall in that triangle? Is it high carb and high fat, low protein, or where exactly would we place it?
yeah, and yeah, I think it varies study to study, but it's somewhere in the realm of like 45%, um, kilocalories from fat in the kind of standard American diet. And that was one of the things that we, I guess, continue to think a lot about with respect to mouse models, because you know that I think one of the challenges in translating from mouse to human is that if you take your average American, they're already on, at least in terms of macronutrients, the equivalent of a mouse high fat diet.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So that would
and
be a
so,
non-ketogenic diet with high fat levels, but also probably high
right.
carbohydrate levels. Yeah, yeah.
And because mice normally on the standard mouse chow consume such tiny amounts of fat, um, if you want to kind of induce the same level of shift in macronutrients, you have to go in humans from a high fat to a ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
And so it kind of, matters depending on like what the baseline intake of the population is.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Um, and so, I think in Americans, it's like, we can do studies readily to either, to lower fat intake, but it's difficult kind of with normal diets to go higher than what a lot of people are already eating.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what would be just to spell it out for people that aren't familiar, if we take a high fat, meaning high fat, high carb diet, and we compare it to a ketogenic diet, what are the differences there, both in the composition of the diet and in terms of the kinds of metabolic shifts that would induce in an animal?
Yeah. So, the big kind of famous shift that happens in terms of a ketogenic diet is that you really, have to lower carbohydrate intake dramatically. And so, when the body kind of shifts from using glucose as its primary fuel to lipids or fat, um, that allows the release of the what are called ketone bodies that go into general circulation and then provide fuel for different tissues. And so that requires kind of the combination of very typically very high levels of fat and then very low carbohydrate intake. In humans it varies, and then in mice we typically remove all of the carbohydrates, and so they're really only eating fat and protein.
Is there anything? This is a topic that I don't hear covered a lot in the literature. So obviously, mice are a convenient model for all the
Mhm.
reasons that people use mice. When we think about them in sort of evolutionary and ecological context, are there wild mice that eat truly high fat or ketogenic diets? Or I guess another way of asking what I'm asking is, would we expect mice to have the same degree of kind of metabolic flexibility that a human being has in terms of its ability to adapt to very large shifts in the fat and carbohydrate content of its diet?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's not something we really looked at in terms of kind of high fat consuming mice, but um, yeah, I mean, we did have one study where we kind of tracked wild mice throughout the course of a year, and this was working with Amy Peterson and her colleagues in the UK, where in the UK they have these beautiful study sites where it's kind of wild, fields where they've gridded off different areas to capture and release mice throughout the course of a year, and this has gone on for decades.
Oh wow.
And so you have the ability to kind of like follow the same mouse over time as they switch from eating, different foods depending on the time of the year. And kind of as expected, we did see a pretty clear shift in the microbiota of these wild mice that we could kind of correlate to the change in eating seeds versus insects primarily. Um, but it's messy, right? Because they
Yeah.
just like in humans, they still have access to different options, and so we don't see the kind of like clear transitions that you might see in a laboratory mouse.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So they will adjust their
and
diet
then
seasonally.
yeah, and I think that is kind of since then people have reported similar kind of seasonal effects in the human microbiome, and so I think that's probably a general kind of feature of animals that are experiencing different nutrients at different times of the year.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but the other thing that we're really interested in now is like thinking about more exotic diets that wild animals consume, and so for example, we've done a lot of work on this drug digoxin, which is a natural product isolated from the foxglove plant. And foxgloves are really toxic to most mammals, but
Hmm.
interestingly, mice are resistant to them. And so we're doing some studies with Denise Deering and other collaborators to kind of track what happens to the microbes in the gut of mice that are kind of foraging on these really toxic plants that humans can't consume.
Hmm. But earlier you said when we give a ketogenic diet, a diet that can induce ketosis in a mouse, you typically have to pretty much just remove all of the carbohydrate. Is does that mean that it's basically harder to get a mouse into ketosis than a human?
Yeah, I definitely think that's true. So yeah, not only is kind of starting the ketogenic process or ketogenesis more challenging, but also mice. Yeah, I mean this is true for a lot of things in mice that they're very lab mice. Even though you might expect them to be wimpy, are often really resistant to a lot of the diseases that we have, and so. Um, we think this is definitely true for metabolic diseases like diabetes and obesity,
Hmm.
as well as other diseases like autoimmune disease. You kind of have to this is why we have to leverage
You
kind
have
of
to really
special
push
mouse
them.
models. Yeah.
Is that I I'm just guessing, so you tell me if I'm right or wrong, but I'm guessing that sort of acts, is that just a byproduct of breeding mice to, to live and survive in the lab, and as a side effect, they're actually hardy in certain ways?
I don't know. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, maybe one of the reasons is like we tend to study younger mice in the
Mm.
lab. Um, no one, although there's exceptions, but it's hard to study a middle-aged or an older mouse.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so, some of these diseases do kind of progressively get worse if you look in an older lab mouse. Um, but yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I don't know, if you look in wild mouse populations, whether or not you can find more evidence of disease. I
Hmm.
think like one of the things that was really clear in the study that we did with Amy is that um, mice in the wild are really, they have a very hard life. And so, I think before any of these chronic diseases happen, they're getting infections and they're getting killed by predators.
Right, right.
And then over the winter, at least in the mice we were studying, there's a huge population crash. And
Yeah, they
so,
starve.
yeah. So, I think there's a lot of other forces that kind of like are acting against even being able to look for these other
Yeah,
diseases.
yeah. But like, one of the things I wanted people to take away from this part of the discussion is obviously mice aren't humans, but there's all sorts of other things that were, there's issues with the literature in terms of how we speak about things, how we set up the experiments that
Mhm.
start to lead people astray in the sense that when you'll often see even with scientists sweeping claims about the high fat diet does this, and they're inferring
Right.
things from rodent studies where all the high fat diets are different from each other and then mapping that onto humans. And it's there's so many like little jumps and assumptions that get made along the way that people often don't realize are being made. One of the things I liked about some of the work that you've done is you've started to fill in some of the blanks here. So one of the studies I wanted to talk to you about was, people are interested in high fat, low fat. People are interested in animal based, plant based, high fiber, low fiber, all these different types of questions, how it affects the microbiome and so forth. You've actually done, well, I'm going to ask you about one study. There's more things I'm sure we can talk about, and I'll let you sort of steer us there. But
Mhm.
you had this 2014 paper that I thought was really interesting. You actually took human beings and you gave one a plant based diet that had high carb levels, so that's not going to be ketogenic. One had an animal based diet that did put people into ketosis, and you actually measured some things across these
Mhm.
people. Can you start to talk about the setup for that study and what the motivation was for it?
Sure. Yeah, I think a colleague of mine called it carnival diets or something. I don't know if it was in derogatory, but yeah, I mean, I think we've kind of been alluding to the logic that got us there, and so we I when I was in grad school, like one of the what I thought was a really exciting finding was that we took lab mice and we put them on a high fat, high sugar diet, um, and compared the microbes in their gut to low fat controls. And then I don't know if you how quickly, or you probably know the answer now, but how quickly you think the microbiome would change if you go on a new diet. But
Well, yeah, I'm spoiled because I know the answer, but so this to set you up for this. One question there was like obviously your microbiome is going to change to your diet, but a big question was how much and how quickly.
Right, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And
And so
that was a really striking thing in these initial mouse experiments is that, I kind of imagined it would be slower and, we
yeah,
might see more gradual effects that
takes weeks to
compound.
adapt to it. It's sort of the slow
Yeah,
roll maybe.
right. But, instead what we saw was just after a single day, it's kind of like a light switch. You can see you go from one configuration of the gut microbiota to another.
Wow. So
And so
literally
it's this.
literally in one day.
Yeah. And so, it was a little bit of a bummer because I spent a lot of time collecting all these other time points. And so that, I mean, it got a little stronger throughout week one, but then, like really all the action was in the first week, at least in the mouse model. And so, uh, that kind of raised the question of whether or not this could happen in humans. Are our microbes actually changing every day as we decide what to eat? Um, and it kind of conflicts with some of the more traditional views of the gut microbiome is that it's like very stable throughout adulthood and that,
Yeah.
there's not a lot of changes over
Yeah.
time.
And I guess
Um,
one thing to unpack there is that statement isn't coming out of nowhere. I think when you measure the microbiomes of a typical person, it will seem pretty stable day to day, week to week. But that's probably an artifact of their lifestyle and their diet being relatively stable.
Yeah, that well, I think multiple things that contribute to that. So one is that like and then this kind of becomes semantics, but it's it's really important how you define stability.
Mm-hmm.
And so like one of the breakthroughs, kind of um, early on in the microbiome field were the development of all these data diversity, like ways of comparing microbial communities to each other. And so that allows you to like plot microbial communities on a PCOA space or some other dimensionality reduction method. And, but typically what you're comparing is multiple people.
Mm-hmm.
So, you have samples of one person over time and then a second person. And if you plot them on a PCOA, typically the samples from the two people stay apart from each other so that you kind of retain that, the signal of individuality.
Yeah. So they're
Um,
they're different from each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean each one is static within the person.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, like within each person, there can be dramatic fluctuations, but as long as my microbiota doesn't become yours,
Yeah.
we're still going to end up apart on the plot. And
Mm-hmm.
um, so yeah, it kind of depends on what the measurement is. And then and then to your other point, I think, yeah, I guess I hadn't appreciated when we got into this stuff that like, although maybe I should have because my diet is pretty boring, but like people really don't change what they eat that much. I mean, we do go to restaurants, so that's a source of chaos, but
Yeah, but it's not
a
like
lot of people have very routine diets.
yeah, it's not like I mean it's certainly not going to be as drastic as what you did in the study. It's not like on Monday I'm doing a vegan Monday, Tuesday, and then a carnivore
Yeah,
Wednesday or a ketogenic Friday. Like it's going to be relatively stable in terms of the overall macronutrient profile and whether I'm generally more plant-based or animal-based for most
right.
people.
Yeah, and like that turns out to be true not just for people that are on explicit diets to lose
Yeah.
weight or for some other reason, but just because, like we're habitual creatures.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
We
like the
tend to
foods I
have very
like.
similar breakfast and lunch.
Yeah. So anyways, like going back
Um,
to this 2014 study, what were the two diets that you used and why did you engineer them the way that you did?
yeah, so kind of the thinking was like we wanted to really push the needle and, try to change macronutrients in a big way. And so that kind of got us to this idea of like, if most of the people coming into the study are already eating a decent amount of fat, we want to get them even higher. We
Mm-hmm.
weren't really intending to study ketogenesis.
Mm.
It was just kind of a happy accident of designing a diet that would be really rich in fat. Um, and then and then I guess like what we realized is that really the only way, one of the which is true in the kind of um weight loss diet literature, if you try the easiest way to get to high fat is to drop carb a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we thought, why don't we just go all the way and make it only meat?
Mm-hmm. So it's basically
So
just meat and cheese. It was an
yeah,
animal-based ketogenic diet.
right,
Meat,
yeah.
cheese,
So
eggs.
much more extreme than what your average person on a ketogenic diet eats, but
Yeah. So it
um,
was high fat, very, very low carb, low fiber, and it's all animal-based foods.
yeah, yeah,
And then the other group was plant-based, and it was basically high carb, high fiber, a mix
right.
of plant-based foods, but it certainly wasn't ketogenic and it certainly wasn't only fat.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, then, once we kind of like realized this would be fun to test an animal-based diet, we thought, we should do the opposite.
Yeah, yeah.
And so, the downside is like these two diets are so different from each other in so many different ways that, it's not a great design in terms of getting at mechanism, right? So
Right. You can't you
if you
can't
see
you
changes, what is driving it is really hard to piece apart.
yeah, you can't you
Um,
can't just you can't conclude from the study, oh, the fiber did this, the protein content did that, the
right.
fat content did this, but it is naturalistic in the sense that you were giving people whole foods, you were giving them diets that some people intentionally, try and eat. There's people out there trying to eat animal-based ketogenic diets.
Right.
There's people
Yeah.
out there trying to maximize fiber content from plant-based whole foods and so forth. And you saw pretty big differences in terms of
Mhm.
what the response was in each group. Can you give us a basic survey of what happened to people eating the plant versus the animal-based diet?
Yeah, so I think the most exciting thing for us kind of gets back to what we were talking about in these early high fat mouse experiments is that we gave people food coloring in along with their special diets for 5 days. The design was that we had daily sampling from people for a few days before each diet and then after each diet. And then the diet each diet arm was given for 5 days. And so along with that, we gave food coloring, and that allowed us to kind of track when the first sample of the new diet came out of the gut. Using that, we could kind of estimate that actually we could see differences, especially on the animal-based diet, in kind of overall structure of the microbiome
Mhm.
just within a single day
Wow.
of being on the diet.
So
And then those, yeah,
you give
go
people
ahead.
each of these. So half the people get a plant-based diet for 5 days, half get an animal-based diet for 5 days. You've also got 5 days of measurement before that shift, and then after that
Mhm.
shift when they're going back and forth to their normal diet. And you're saying that in that 5 days, you see drastic changes in the microbiome, and you can actually start to pick them up within just one day.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, and really like the strongest effect was going from kind of, their standard um, starting diet onto the animal-based diet.
Hmm.
Although we also did, see some differences in response to the plant-based diet.
Yeah, so you see
Um,
differences in both groups. Obviously, there are going to be different differences in the plant
right.
versus the animal group, but overall, sort of the magnitude of the shift was probably stronger for the animal-based diet.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one thing we kind of speculated that I still think is true is that um like oftentimes the study design, if you think about fiber, for example, we take people that are on a standard American diet and then try to ramp up fiber intake.
Yeah, here
And
it's the
it's
opposite.
much more, yeah, it's much more rare that we do the opposite.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And so this is a diet where you're really depleting, dramatically depleting the carbohydrates that a lot of bacteria in the gut are
yeah.
going after.
Yeah. So the people on a plant-based diet are increasing their fiber content. So they start at some baseline, and it's
Hmm.
certainly not zero. Maybe it's, some people might argue it was higher, it was low, but it was some fiber content
Hmm.
as most people would eat at baseline. That goes up in the plant-based group. And then the animal-based group, they're really getting no fiber. There's essentially
Right.
zero
Yeah.
dietary fiber. And
Hmm.
what would, before you looked at your results, what would the prediction there be on how increasing fiber versus taking it down to zero would affect people?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah. The other thing I wanted to mention is that so that one of the really, actually the first study I worked on when I was in the Gordon lab as a graduate student, I was a brand new rotation student, assigned to work with Ruth Lay, who had come from Norm Pace's lab and was experienced with a lot of these tools for microbial ecology. Um, and Ruth, before I got there, had gone to the San Francisco Zoo and collected a bunch of poop from different animals.
Hmm.
And so the idea was, now that we had the ability to sequence microbes in the gut, we could kind of compare which microbes were in a zebra versus a giraffe versus a lion
I see. So you could get a
versus a
sense for
human.
what a carnivore microbiome looks like versus a herbivore microbiome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, kind of one of the takeaways from that study is that you could see these correlations between, as you might expect, the carnivores and the omnivores and herbivores all grouped separately. Humans kind of looked like we were regular omnivores. At the time, it was just a handful of people, but you could kind of like group animals by diet just based on microbes in their gut.
Yeah.
And
Which
then subsequent,
makes
yeah,
intuitive sense, right?
hmm
Yeah.
and then after that, Brian Meggie, another graduate student in the lab, did metagenomic sequencing of those same samples to kind of compare the levels of different genes in the gut of carnivores and herbivores. And it kind of as you might predict, the microbes are really flexible in what they can metabolize, and so when in the gut of your typical herbivore, you see a lot of genes that are involved in breaking down plant polysaccharides, these complex carbs that are in plant products.
Yeah.
And then when you look in the carnivores, there is an enrichment for genes that are involved in breaking down proteins and amino acids and using those for kind of alternative types of bacterial fermentation. And so there was kind of a nice kind of genetic signature of what types of pathways might be useful to a microbe in a
Yeah.
carnivore versus an herbivore. And so that was kind of what we were thinking leading into the human study, and in many ways kind of played out, especially when we started to look at the expression of genes in the community.
Mhm.
We
So
could see some of these kind of signatures of switching from plant fermentation to protein fermentation.
yeah. So basically you had a sense from prior work. You guys literally went to the zoo. You literally looked at
Mm-hmm.
the gut microbiome of herbivores like zebras, carnivores, like other animals. You collected the waste from animals at the zoo, and you had a notion that certain animals on certain diets had certain microbiomes. This involved microbes with metabolism that made sense, right? If it's a
Mm-hmm.
plant eater, it's got metabolic genes turned on and microbes present that break down plant sugars and plant fiber and things like that. And then if it's a carnivore microbiome, you've got stuff that's involved in
Mm-hmm.
breaking down the amino acids from proteins and stuff like that. So you had a
Mm-hmm.
sense for what like the carnivore to herbivore spectrum of the microbiome looked like.
Right.
And when you gave people these diets, broadly speaking, they conform to that directionally speaking.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I think it's, the more you think about it, it's kind of wild that you can become a carnivore,
Yeah. Well, I mean,
that
it is kind of wild, but at the same time, I've learned a lot about this the last year or so. And to mention just one podcast that was really interesting, I had these two guys on. They're basically paleoanthropologists by training. And long story short, they studied ancient DNA and ancient tissue samples
Mhm.
from the Clovis peoples of North America during the last ice age. And they basically showed that these people were eating the same diet that saber-toothed cats were eating, which was probably a
Mm,
megafauna meat-rich ketogenic diet.
interesting.
So people in
Yeah.
history, some of them have eaten that type of diet.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and I think what our data suggests is that your microbes are really plastic and that
Yeah.
they can adapt to these changes rapidly. And so, it raises a lot of interesting kind of evolutionary questions that we're not really working so much on in our lab, but Rachel Carmody, a former postdoc from our lab, thinks a lot about
Yeah. When you look at, I mean, when you,
the potential for microbes to kind of open up new access to nutrients as they adapt to what
yeah,
humans are trying.
yeah. I mean, look, one of the things your study clearly shows is, as you said, you see big changes in the gut microbiome composition to both types of diets in different directions in 5 days. You start to see it within one day. And that fits with the idea that humans are just very metabolically flexible. And when you start to
Hmm.
think about it like holistically, when you just look at the variety of diets out there today, the variety of cultures
Hmm.
and cuisines out there today, and the stuff I mentioned before and other stuff from the paleo literature, humans have eaten all sorts of different diets, and that's enabled us to go into, basically every corner of the globe. So it makes perfect sense that a feature of our species would be metabolic flexibility, and that would
Right.
imply gut microbiome adaptability as well.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and I think that the kind of diversity of the gut microbiota allows, and not only kind of this like flexibility where microbes that are really well adapted to different types of diets can bloom or decrease in abundance. But also, nice work from Justin Sonnenberg and others have shown that even within a single species, you can, microbes, the bacteria can kind of turn on and off different pathways, and so
Yeah, yeah,
they have the ability to kind of change what they're eating depending on what we eat.
yeah. So it's not just that our microbiome can shift in terms of which species are present. Even you could have the same microbiome and the
Right.
same exact composition. It could switch which genes are turned on and off, and therefore it's metabolic properties. The full version of this episode is available to paid subscribers at the Mind and Matter Substack at mindandmatter.substack.com. The full version is also freely available on my YouTube page. Just look up Mind and Matter or my name, Nick Jikomis, on YouTube, and you'll find the episode there. This is a partial version of the episode, and so it'll cut off partway through, but you'll still get a significant portion. So sign up to become a paid subscriber at Substack or visit my YouTube page to get the full episode. This episode is supported in part by Athletic Greens. Their main product, AG1, is a comprehensive and convenient daily nutrition product containing 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients with less than 1 gram of sugar per serving, no nasty chemicals or artificial anything. It's gluten and dairy free and compatible with paleo, vegan, vegetarian, and ketogenic diets. AG1 is a quick and convenient way to supplement your diet to help ensure your body is getting the nutrients it needs. It comes in powder form, and you can mix it in water and drink it, or you can put it into a smoothie or a shake or something like that. I mix it into water and drink it, and it's super convenient. If you go to athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter, Athletic Greens will give you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Their vitamin D product comes in tincture form, so you just take 1 drop each day. A large fraction of the population is actually vitamin D deficient, especially in winter months when we get less sun exposure. And vitamin D is super important for the proper function of the immune system and for a variety of other things. So visit athleticgreens.com/mindandmatter or click the link in the episode description. You'll get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D with your first purchase.